Today's classic interview is really straightforward in terms of what I discussed with Jonathan Metzl about 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago. Mental health gun databases. Obvious, right? You create a database, it helps people not get guns, it helps to prevent people who shouldn't have guns from getting them. However, one lesser known aspect of those mental health databases are that they are incredibly racially tinged. And Jonathan Metzl joined me in February of 2013 to talk about that. Let's go back to that important topic. Joining me is Jonathan Metzl. He's the director of Vanderbilt Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. His last book, The Protest Psychosis, deals with how schizophrenia has become a disease associated with and overdiagnosed with black men. I want to talk about this, Jonathan, first kind of specifically your findings, and then later talk a little bit about the gun debate that's going on and how this may tie into these so-called mental health databases. So first, let's talk about the overdiagnosis part. Tell us about your research there.
Absolutely. So it's interesting for me that actually the two topics that you just mentioned overlap a great deal. The kind of central narrative of the book and of the research that I've been doing since the book looks at an interesting and troubling cultural phenomenon, which is the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia in African American men, which really started, according to data, in about the 1960s. It was interesting for me to find in my research that prior to the 1960s, we thought of schizophrenia as an illness that was most often associated with really docile white women. So in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the United States, you would see movies and films and even hospital asylum wards where schizophrenia was a diagnosis that was applied to white housewives or women who were kind of troubled or in need of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy.
Is this an extension? Is this an extension of those ads that sometimes float around about how to deal with nervous women and hysteria and that type of thing?
That was totally part of that story. So at the time, people thought that schizophrenia was almost a neurotic or personality condition. There was a famous movie in 1948 called The Snake Pit with Olivia de Havilland, and it told a story of a kind of neurotic white woman who went crazy when she got married. And so there was this whole kind of cultural aura around the culture of psychoanalysis at the time that kind of sent the message not only that schizophrenia was an illness of white women, but also that schizophrenia was an illness of docility. And so a lot of times you would see these women as being kind of troubled or, as you mentioned, neurotic, but nobody was really afraid of them. There was no cultural discussion that, oh, people with mental illness might be violent or hostile or dangerous. And what I found was that all of a sudden in the 1960s, quite literally in a 5 or 10 year period, you see that all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, this real fear of mental illness. And part of what's happening is that there's a different association with schizophrenia, in which all of a sudden people started associating schizophrenia not only with angry black men, but also with violence at that time. And so all of a sudden in the 1960s and 1970s, you see a host of cultural representations that basically talk about angry black killers that are on the loose, or schizophrenic black men that want guns. There are FBI most wanted lists that all of a sudden start showing angry black men with schizophrenia. And so really what you see in this very brief period is this all of a sudden this association, a kind of change in the assumptions about the race and the gender of schizophrenia that really extend into the present day. And so one thing that I've been doing a fair amount of kind of conversations about the gun violence issue. And one thing I point out is that we didn't always think about people with mental illness in general and people with schizophrenia in particular as being violent. In a way, all these transformations happened in the 1970s, and they were linked to transformations in race as well.
So this is interesting when we talk more specifically about the gun debate that's going on now, because I had a conservative on the show a couple of weeks ago, and we were trying to kind of have some kind of consensus about what are effective ways of reducing gun violence. And then he was talking about, well, we need to really keep guns out of the hands of people who are most likely to commit violence with them. And he used a lot of what I consider to be kind of racially coded terms, including the children of single parents, urban areas, and drug related gun homicides and all these things, which speak very clearly to me with racial connections. And it's interesting that even the idea of a mental health database could be racially coded if you think that it's going to be it's going to overrepresent misdiagnosed schizophrenia in African Americans. Am I off on this?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. I would make two separate points about that. And one, let me just say that before I even make any points about it, let me say that don't think I can't be entirely critical of this association between mental illness and violence, because when we see these horrific crimes, like what happened in Newtown or in Colorado, or the string of horrific crimes that we've seen in Arizona, there is, I think, a justifiable human impulse to say that what's happening now is not sane. That in a way, a normal person would not be doing this. And we struggle for words to understand what had happened. And certainly also in the incidents of a lot of these mass shooters, there are different kinds of mental illness histories. And so in that sense, I don't think that the rush to assume that there's a mental illness connection is entirely something that's entirely problematic, because it helps us make sense of what's happening here. At the same time, it's troubling for a couple of reasons. And one is that as an aggregate group, I think that the data on gun violence is really pretty unconvincing in terms of who's committing the crimes. And so, even leaving the race issue aside, people with mental illness are far more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators of violence. And this association that we need to fear the mentally ill is really kind of an inversion of what's happening in the real world, in which people with mental illness in violence in general and also gun violence are far more likely to be attacked because of a variety of reasons. And so one is that we're kind of promoting the stereotype of the violent mentally ill person, when really reality does not bear that out at all. And the second point, as you mentioned, is that there is a racial component to this. And I say that because in the research I've done, I've looked at the 60s and 70s. And there was a different debate about guns at that time. There, all of a sudden, in the 60s and 70s, people like Huey Newton and people in the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and other people, Robert Williams, a NAACP leader in the South, were arguing that African Americans needed to arm themselves in order to protect themselves against racist aggression. And so there were movements of, violence is as natural as cherry pie, and movements to arm Black people. And all of a sudden, white society started saying, no, that's mental illness, that we don't want Black people to get arms. And what they did was they passed the Voting Right Act of 1968. The Gun Control Act of 1968. And so, in a way, at that moment, there was this kind of fear, this racialized fear that tied into the gun debate at the time, and it led to a kind of association between guns and really Black protests.
Well, the double standard and the hypocrisy is also fascinating, because back then it was mental illness to think that you needed guns to protect yourself from racism. At the same time, now we have this entire group of individuals saying they need guns to protect themselves, in many cases from the possibility of a tyrannical government or of any other number of things. But nobody's bringing up that idea is mental illness. That's never suggested now.
No, and you made my point exactly. I think that's exactly the point, that what we see in the 60s and 70s is that when people like Huey Newton were saying we need guns, society was very comfortable at pathologizing what it called Black culture. In the present day, when we have shooters who are very often white, troubled white males, it's never, oh, we need to blame white culture for that crime. It's always, this is a lone troubled individual, and the mental illness part plays right into it. We say, oh, it's just this one person. It's not a cultural debate. And so really just the fact that these shooters are white and we have a very different cultural response, I think is part of the kind of, as you say, very strong double standard that we have here. A second point that I would make is that if you look at the recent Pew research, African Americans are far more likely to support gun control. It's upwards of 70%, far more likely than white Americans to support gun control. And so in a way, a lot of this NRA kind of talk is really being driven. It's very hypocritical to say that it's coming from inner cities and stuff like that, when people in the inner cities want gun control more than anybody, I think.
We've been speaking with Jonathan Metzl, director of Vanderbilt Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. The book is The Protest Psychosis. Jonathan, great to have you on. I want to have you back to talk about the next question, which is what will be actually the effect on gun purchases of these proposed mental health databases? But we'll leave that for next time.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I would love that.